Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, the leaders of Rwanda and South Africa embark on a furious row over the insurgent invasion of DR Congo. Also, Africa's CDC warns of the Congolese conflict's potentially chaotic impact on regional public health in the long term. And a major energy summit wraps up billions of dollars in pledges from world banks to boost an ambitious plan called Mission 300 to bring electricity to at least half of the 600 million people on the continent currently without power. But first, the advance of M23 militia through eastern DR Congo has also fueled an intensifying diplomatic spat between South Africa and Rwanda. Now, Rwanda's accused of backing the rebels whose march on the Congolese provincial capital of Goma this week and who continue to advance into South Kivu. Diplomatic pressures ramping up on Kigali to cut ties with the insurgents, and France's foreign minister headed to Rwanda on Thursday to ask President Kagame to withdraw troops that the UN says have been fighting alongside the M23. Now, 13 South African soldiers from the Southern African Development Community's mission in DRC have been killed in the past week's invasion. Kagame has laid into his South African counterpart for blaming those deaths on Rwanda. Our regional correspondent talks us through.
Things really escalated on Wednesday when South African President Cyril Ramaphosa posted on the social media platform X. He expressed his condolences for the 13 South African peacemakers who were killed in the conflict in eastern DRC, and he accused those deaths on an escalation by the M23 rebel group and the Rwandan armed forces. Now, Rwandan President Paul Kagame quickly fired back in a long reply on the platform. He said that during previous conversations with Ramaphosa, the South African president had confirmed that those peacemakers were not killed by the M23, but actually by the Congolese armed forces. Later on Wednesday, the East African community held a virtual meeting, which was aimed at fostering peace and dialogue between Congolese President Felix Tshisekedi and his Rwandan counterpart. Tshisekedi didn't end up turning up to the meeting, and Paul Kagame used the opportunity to express his anger and frustration towards Ramaphosa. He accused the South African president of pretending to be a peacemaker while actually supporting the FDLR, a militia group.
He's also there pretending to be playing a peacemaker role, and he has a force that has been fighting alongside FDLR and has been fighting the M23 on the instructions of Tshisekedi, because these are people who are not supposed to be in Congo, that these are from Rwanda, or the M23 are not Rwandans, please. And South Africa dares even issue threats about what is likely to happen after that, and so on and so forth. Of course, we will see what threats they are talking about.
He ended his speech, which lasted several minutes, with, and I quote, the words, "If South Africa prefers confrontation, Rwanda will deal with the matter in that context any day." Now, the other members of the East African community didn't seem able to ease those escalating tensions.
Liv Bizo there for us in Kenya. Now, back in DR Congo, life is very slowly returning to the streets of Goma after the takeover by the M23 and its Rwandan escorts this week. Emmett Livingston is there and tells us more.
There were still traces of the recent fierce fighting everywhere across Goma in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo on Thursday. In some areas, we saw dead bodies lying on the road, and in others, abandoned military jeeps that were filled with bullet holes. More and more people were walking around on the street, but shops were still closed. Many had their windows smashed, and there were very few cars on the road. M23 fighters, though, were everywhere, stationed at crossings or zooming up and down in jeeps. M23 rebels and Rwandan troops captured the city earlier this week in a dramatic escalation of a 3-year conflict. Congolese troops and pro-government militia fighters held out as long as they could. There are still pockets of resistance in northern Goma, but the city is effectively under M23 control. Much of Goma is still suffering enormously because of severe disruptions to ordinary life due to the fighting. Internet is cut and there's no electricity. Water is also in short supply for many people. The leaders of the M23, as well as its political branch, the Congo River Alliance, held a press conference in a plush hotel in the city centre on Thursday, where they promised to fix all of these problems. They were flanked by fighters dressed in battle fatigues who had their faces covered. The M23 also affirmed that it was there to stay, pledging to govern Goma and even raising the prospect of further territorial expansion. But away from the projected image of control, there was still an air of extreme uncertainty in the city. Many residents said they were just happy that the fighting was over.
Emmett Livingston there speaking to us from Goma. Now, the head of the Africa CDC has warned that the fighting in eastern DR Congo raises the risk of a new pandemic. In calling for an end to what he said is an unnecessary war, Jean Kaseya has flagged the conflict's potentially chaotic impact on public health in the long term. Besides the hundreds killed and thousands injured, the immediate effect on Goma's medical landscape has also been devastating.
In this packed hospital ward, bleeding patients are forced to wait for their turn. As the influx of wounded people grows, this emergency room in Goma is struggling to cope.
The current situation is chaotic. In 3 days, we have received more than 400 people. From January to today, we have more than 1,000 injured.
Following intense clashes between the Congolese forces and the M23 rebel group, the hospital's capacity of 146 beds has been reached. Doctors are currently healing more than 200 patients. Most of the injuries here are caused by explosive devices.
There have been days here when we've done 14, 15 open abdominal surgeries with injuries to all internal organs. These surgeries take at least 2 hours.
On Tuesday, the UN and other aid agencies warned that there are dead bodies in the streets of Goma as hospitals are getting increasingly overwhelmed.
There are currently hundreds of people in hospital, most admitted with gunshot and shrapnel wounds. Secondary infections become a health risk. WHO is especially worried for the health and safety of women and girls who are at the higher risk of violence, including rape. Pregnant women are at risk with very high maternal death rates.
Food scarcity, lack of electricity and internet blackouts are exacerbating the increasingly severe humanitarian crisis in the city.
Well, moving on from the Congolese conflict, a conservatively estimated 600 million people across the continent don't currently have access to electricity. A plan to halve that number in just 6 years has got a $6 billion boost this week. It's called Mission 300 and needs a total $90 billion to pull off. Global lenders like the African Development Bank have already committed to stepping up around $48 billion. And the newest pledges to add to that came from the Islamic Development Bank and the Asia Infrastructure Bank at this week's high-stakes energy summit that was held in Tanzania. Now, one of the big names that was there was Joseph Nganga, who is the Africa Director for the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, which is central to bringing together all of the different elements needed to move Mission 300 forward. Joseph, thanks so much for making time to speak to me. Now, first of all, you know, this understanding of the importance of expanding access to electricity in Africa is nothing new. One thing that did come out of the summit was a Pan-African declaration to really move things forward on this front. But beyond its value as a gesture, what about it do you genuinely think can act as a real milestone in measurably improving Africa's energy access?
Absolutely, and thank you for having me. And in this day and age when Africa is trying to develop, energy access is critical. And what's most unique about this summit is there's real money behind it, $48 billion from the two banks, as you mentioned, and another $6 billion in commitments from other organizations, including €1 billion from AFD, as announced by President Macron by video yesterday as well. What's also different is African governments have come together and made a commitment to make regulations possible to accelerate adoption of energy on the continent. So on the one hand, you have policy, regulation, commitments from our African head of states, and on the other, you have substantial resources to jumpstart the process of electrifying 300 million Africans. That's what's different this time.
So it sounds like there's a real internal push and will to move forward on this. And when we were speaking earlier, you're kind of going more into detail about the urgency for this that's coming from inside the continent. What do you think it says about shifts in African demographics and development, and also the continent's wider geopolitical relationships?
Absolutely. If you think about it, electricity is no longer one of many things that a government can provide. It's the foundation on which all other services that governments provide our citizens need can develop and can be given on. So it is the enabler for a lot of other things. You see that particularly with our young people, if they're going to be competitive in this world, in this day and age, they have to have digital skills which require electricity. Financial inclusion today cannot happen if you don't have access to a mobile phone that can only be charged with electricity. And crucially, we're moving to an electrified economy where everything from transport, whether it's two-wheelers, three-wheelers, or trains, are all being driven by electricity, as it serves as one of the most affordable, cleanest fuels for driving our economies. So in this day and age, electricity is not just a nice to have, it's an absolutely critical enabler for our continent's development.
So it's essential to all of the mundane day-to-day staples that so many of us take for granted. But in these kind of conversations and commitments, is the kind of electricity that Africa is going to be going after a big consideration? Do climate concerns play into any of the goals being set out in that declaration that came out this week, or in any of the conversations that were held in or in the run-up to the summit?
Look, the reality is electrification is very country-specific. A country must decide its electrification plan based on the resources it has available to it. Whether they're renewable resources or fossil fuel resources, a country has a right to develop itself based on what it has access to. But the reality today is that renewable energy, particularly distributed renewable, is lending itself as the most cost-effective, most technology-appropriate way to electrify our rural areas. Additionally, if a country chooses to electrify through fossil fuels, there's a high risk that it ends up with stranded assets as climate action continues. So a country must determine its path, but there's strong indication that renewable energy is the most competitive, most affordable way to do so, and the risk of going the fossil fuel path creates long-term stranded asset risk for countries that cannot afford to have any of its capital or any of its infrastructure stranded.
Thank you so much. Joseph Nganga there, the VP for Africa, speaking to us about some of the goals of that energy summit in Tanzania this week, as the continent goes after massively ramping up access to electricity for millions of its citizens. Well, that, though, is all we have time for Eye on Africa at the moment. Thanks for joining us, though. Do so again if you can. Till then, take care.